The streets of Cleveland pulsed with energy, alive with the steady rhythm of honking horns, hurried footsteps, and murmured conversations. The winter wind carried a sharp bite, cutting through the towering buildings and weaving between the restless pedestrians. At the corner of Broad Street and 17th Avenue, Leonard sat huddled against the cold brick wall of a convenience store. His coat, tattered and too thin for the season, barely shielded him from the elements. His cardboard sign, propped up beside him, bore the same simple plea he had scribbled every morning. "Anything helps, God bless." At 42 years old, Leonard had been living on the streets for nearly a year. His life had unraveled faster than he could hold it together. First his job, then his apartment, then the last thread of stability that kept him grounded. Each day was a gamble. Sometimes a kind passerby would drop a few coins into his cup, but more often people passed by, avoiding eye contact, quickening their pace, as if acknowledging his existence would burden them. He had learned to recognize people's patterns, to watch the way their feet moved as they walked past him. Some hurried in polished dress shoes, on their way to jobs in glass towers that loomed over the city. Others in sneakers moved with the carefree energy of youth, their earbuds plugged in, oblivious to the world around them. High heels clicked sharply against the pavement as well-dressed women clutched steaming coffee cups, their conversations breezing by just like they did. But then, something different caught his eye. A pair of immaculate white sneakers stopped just a few feet away from him. Not just expensive, but the kind only someone young and well-off would own. Leonard's gaze drifted upward, taking in the crisp lines of a tailored jacket, the relaxed posture of someone who had never felt the weight of the world pressing down on their shoulders. The boy, tall, composed, and strikingly familiar, stood at the street corner, scrolling through his phone. He seemed completely unaware of the silent attention he was drawing from people around him. Whispers spread through the crowd, some curious, some excited, and a few even reached for their phones, discreetly snapping photos. Leonard squinted, trying to place the face. He had seen him before, somewhere, maybe in the news, maybe on television. The realization hovered just out of reach. A flicker of hesitation crossed Leonard's mind. He wasn't one to approach strangers outright. He had learned the hard way that people either ignored you or looked at you with pity. Both reactions stung the same. But something about the young man's presence was different. He wasn't rushing like the others, wasn't lost in conversation or preoccupied with getting to his next destination. He stood still, observing, almost as if he were taking in the city in a way most people never did. Leonard took a deep breath, forcing a smile, and gathered the courage to speak. "Hey, young man," he called, his voice rough from the cold. "Can you spare $1?" The boy froze mid-scroll, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. He turned his head slightly, as if to confirm that he had heard correctly. Slowly he looked down at Leonard, his expression unreadable. For a moment the world around them seemed to slow. Leonard had been here before, asking, waiting, bracing himself for the inevitable rejection, a polite nod, an apologetic glance, a murmured "sorry" before they walked away. He was ready for it, had trained himself not to feel disappointment anymore. But what happened next was anything but ordinary. The young man's gaze didn't flicker away. Instead, he studied Leonard, his brow furrowing slightly. And then, instead of reaching into his pocket for loose change or brushing him off like most would, he asked something that caught Leonard completely off guard. "What do you need it for?" The question hung in the air, unexpected and disarming. It wasn't dismissive or cruel. There was no mockery in his voice. If anything, he sounded genuinely curious. Leonard felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to being questioned, and certainly not in a way that suggested the person actually cared about the answer. He hesitated before rubbing his hands together for warmth, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of the boy's steady gaze. "A cup of coffee would be nice," he admitted. "Maybe a sandwich, if I'm lucky." His voice faltered. He didn't know why, but saying it out loud to this kid, who was clearly from a world so different from his own, made it feel strangely vulnerable. The boy took a step closer, tucking his phone into his jacket pocket. His presence was commanding, not in an intimidating way, but in a way that made Leonard feel seen, truly seen, for the first time in years. "What's your name?" the boy asked. Leonard blinked, momentarily thrown by the question. People rarely asked his name. Most never even looked at his face long enough to wonder if he had one. "Leonard," he said quietly, almost as if testing the sound of his own name. The boy nodded slightly, as if filing the information away. Then, with a calm confidence that felt completely out of place in the chaos of the city, he introduced himself. "I'm Barron." Leonard's breath caught. The name clicked into place instantly. Barron Trump. That was why he looked familiar. The youngest son of Donald Trump, a name known worldwide. But there was no arrogance in his tone, no hint of self-importance. Just a simple, direct introduction. And somehow that made all the difference. The hum of the city returned, the blaring horns, the muffled voices, the hurried footsteps. But something about the exchange between them had shifted the air. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet undeniable. Leonard shifted uneasily on the cold pavement, unsure of what to say. Barron Trump wasn't supposed to be here, crouching down, looking him in the eye, treating him like an equal. And yet, here he was. For the first time in a long time, Leonard didn't feel invisible. And somehow he knew this moment was about to change everything. The city moved around them, indifferent and restless, but in this moment, everything seemed to slow. Leonard wasn't used to conversations lasting more than a few seconds. Most people walked past him without a word, pretending he didn't exist. But Barron Trump wasn't like most people. He stood there, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his sleek jacket, studying Leonard as if truly trying to understand him. Not just as a homeless man on the street, but as a person with a story. Leonard shifted under the weight of the silence. He had asked for $1, expecting either rejection or, at best, a quick transaction. A few coins tossed his way before the stranger moved on. Instead, he got a question. "How long have you been out here?" The words weren't harsh, but they hit Leonard like a sharp gust of wind. He hadn't been asked that in a long time. People rarely cared about the why. They saw the tattered clothes, the weathered face, the dirt-streaked hands, and assumed they already knew his story. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Almost a year now," he admitted, his voice rough from the cold. "Lost my job after the plant shut down. Thought I could keep things together, but my health went south. Couldn't keep up with rent. One thing led to another." He trailed off, shaking his head. "Been downhill ever since." Barron listened intently, his expression unreadable but focused. There was no judgment in his eyes, just understanding. "What about family?" he asked. Leonard clenched his jaw, a flicker of pain crossing his face before he let out a bitter chuckle. "Not much of that anymore. My folks passed years ago. My brother and I, we haven't talked in ages." His voice dropped, his gaze fixed on the ground. "Guess I don't have much left to lose." The silence between them grew heavier, but Barron didn't look away. He didn't offer empty words of sympathy or a rehearsed line about how things would get better. Instead, he reached into his pocket. Leonard's pulse quickened. He had asked for $1, just one, but Barron's movement suggested something different. When his hand emerged, he wasn't holding a single crumpled bill. He was holding a crisp $100 bill. Leonard blinked, convinced his eyes were playing tricks on him. "Here," Barron said simply, extending the bill toward him. "This should cover more than coffee." For a moment, Leonard couldn't move. The money? The gesture? It didn't feel real. He had spent months surviving off scraps, hoping for spare change, and now, out of nowhere, Someone was handing him more than he had seen in weeks. "Are you serious?" Leonard finally managed to ask, his voice cracking. Barron shrugged lightly, the corners of his lips tilting into the faintest hint of a smile. "Because I can." The simplicity of the answer stunned Leonard more than the money itself. He had met kind strangers before, people who had offered him a meal or a couple of dollars, but no one had ever said something like that. There was no guilt in Barron's voice, no condescending tone, no expectation of gratitude. Before Leonard could find the right words to thank him, Barron leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "But listen," he said, his tone softer now. "This isn't just about the money. I want you to promise me something." Leonard tightened his grip on the bill, his hand slightly trembling. "What's that?" Barron's expression grew more serious. "If I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Deal?" The words hit Leonard harder than he expected. He had spent so long feeling invisible, feeling like people only saw him as a lost cause. But here was this kid, not just giving him money, but challenging him to believe in himself again. He swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yeah, deal." Barron straightened up, satisfied with the answer. The crowd around them, which had been quietly watching, had grown larger. Whispers rippled through the people standing nearby. Some were recording on their phones. Others exchanged glances, surprised by what they were witnessing. A young man known for his privilege, crouching down and not just giving a handout, but giving hope. Leonard felt a familiar wave of shame creeping up his spine. He didn't like being the center of attention, didn't like the way people stared at him as if he were some kind of spectacle. But when he looked back at Barron, he saw calm confidence. The teenager didn't seem fazed by the growing audience. Instead, he reached into his pocket again, pulling out a small notepad and pen. Quickly, he scribbled something down, then tore off the paper and handed it to Leonard. "Go to this address tomorrow morning," Barron said. "They'll help you out. Tell them Barron sent you." Leonard hesitated before unfolding the note. His hands trembled slightly as he read it. It was the address of a local shelter and resource center, a place he had heard of but had been too ashamed to visit. "I'll make sure they're expecting you," Barron added. His voice wasn't demanding, but it left no room for doubt. Leonard looked up at him, overwhelmed by the moment. This wasn't just about a kind stranger giving him money. It was a push in the right direction, a lifeline. The air around them seemed to shift. This wasn't just a fleeting act of generosity. It was the first step toward something bigger. Leonard clutched the note in one hand and the bill in the other. He had spent so long expecting nothing from people that he didn't know how to react when someone actually gave him something that mattered. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I'll be there." Barron nodded, offering him one last knowing glance before turning to leave. The crowd parted for him, the whispers growing louder as he walked away. Leonard watched him disappear into the city, his figure blending into the stream of people. For the first time in years, Leonard didn't just feel like a man surviving on the streets. He felt seen. And for the first time and even longer, he felt hope. The cold morning air bit at Leonard's face as he stood outside a modest brick building on the quieter side of Cleveland. His hands, still rough from the months spent braving the streets, clutched the worn note Barron had given him the day before. The address led him to Hope Outreach Resource Center, a place he had heard about but never dared to enter. The sign above the door was simple, but it carried a weight Leonard had forgotten. Hope. He hesitated at the entrance, shifting on his feet, staring at the glass doors like they were some kind of threshold between his old life and something unfamiliar. The $100 bill Barron had handed him was still tucked inside his jacket pocket, untouched. A part of him wanted to hold on to it, not because of its value, but because it felt like proof. proof that someone had cared, even if just for a moment. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. Warmth immediately embraced him, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The walls were lined with bulletin boards, covered in job postings, resource pamphlets, and community event flyers. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the low hum of conversation. Behind the reception desk, a woman with kind eyes looked up and smiled. "Good morning. How can I help you?" Leonard hesitated, his fingers tightening around the slip of paper. He wasn't used to kindness, at least not the kind that didn't come with strings attached. Swallowing hard, he placed the note on the counter and pushed it toward her. Barron sent me." Her expression softened as she read the name. "Oh, you must be Leonard." She stood, motioning for him to follow. "We've been expecting you." Something in her voice made Leonard pause. They were expecting him? He wasn't just another person wandering in off the street. Someone had made sure he would be taken care of. That realization hit him harder than he expected. She led him down a hallway, where a caseworker was waiting in a small, cozy office. The man, dressed in a simple sweater and slacks, greeted Leonard with an easy smile and motioned for him to sit. "I heard a little bit about you," he said, settling into his chair. "Why don't you tell me what's been going on?" Leonard hesitated at first, but something about the way the man listened, really listened, made the words spill out before he could stop them. He talked about the factory job he lost, the medical bills that piled up, the eviction notice that came faster than he could find a solution. He talked about the nights spent shivering under bridges, the meals skipped to make sure the next day wouldn't be worse, and finally he talked about Barron. The caseworker nodded, jotting down notes. "Well, the good news is, we can help." He flipped through a few papers before pushing them toward Leonard. "We have an open bed in our shelter, a health checkup scheduled for you this afternoon, and we can start the process of getting you into one of our job training programs." Leonard stared at the papers, struggling to process what was happening. It was too much, too fast. He had spent so long expecting doors to slam shut in his face that he didn't know what to do when one finally opened. "Are you sure?" His voice was hoarse, as if he wasn't convinced this wasn't some cruel joke. The caseworker smiled. "Absolutely. All we need from you is a commitment to show up." Leonard swallowed hard. Show up. It sounded simple, but the weight of those words was heavier than anything he had carried in a long time. Later, that evening, as he sat on the edge of the small cot in the shelter, he stared down at his hands. He had showered for the first time in months. His clothes had been replaced with clean, donated ones. He had a warm meal in his stomach, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he didn't feel like a ghost wandering through life. But what stunned him even more was that outside these walls, the world was already talking about him. Unbeknownst to Leonard, his interaction with Barron had been captured on video by someone passing by. The footage, showing the son of a former president crouching down to talk to a homeless man, had gone viral overnight. Millions of people had watched it, shared it, commented on it. Some called Barron's gesture a rare act of genuine kindness. Others debated whether it was simply a publicity stunt. But regardless of opinion, one thing was undeniable. The story had struck a chord with people across the country. Social media exploded with the hashtag Kindness Challenge as people shared their own stories of helping strangers, paying it forward, and being inspired by what had started as a simple request for $1. Donations poured into Hope Outreach Resource Center, enough to expand their programs and help even more people like Leonard. But Leonard didn't know any of this, not yet. At that moment, all he knew was that for the first time in a long time, he had a place to sleep, a plan for the future, and a reason to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could change. And all of it had started because someone had stopped, listened, and chosen to see him as more than just another nameless face on the street. The air inside Hope Outreach Resource Center was warmer than the streets Leonard had known for the past year, but he still felt a lingering chill, the kind that came from uncertainty. He had spent so long moving through life like a ghost, barely seen, barely acknowledged. Now he had a place to sleep, a hot meal, and for the first time in a long time, a plan. But even with these newfound resources, one question kept circling in his mind. Was this real? Leonard sat in the shelter's common room, stirring a cup of coffee with shaky hands. Around him, other men and women talked quietly, sharing their own struggles, their own versions of how life had unraveled beneath them. Some had been here for months. Others had only just arrived, like him, trying to rebuild what had been lost. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the note Barron had given him the day before. The small, crumpled piece of paper with the address that had led him here. He traced the edges with his fingers, still trying to process how a random encounter on the street had turned into this. That's when a staff member approached him, a knowing smile on her face. "Leonard, have you seen the news?" He frowned. "News?" She gestured for him to follow, leading him to an office where a small TV screen flickered with the news broadcast. Leonard's breath caught in his throat. On the screen was him. Well, not just him, Barron too. The footage showed the moment they had met. Barron crouching down, handing him the money, speaking to him like an equal. Someone must have recorded it from the sidewalk. It had already gone viral. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, "Barron Trump's act of kindness sparks nationwide movement." Leonard's stomach tightened as he listened. The video had millions of views. People all over the country were talking about it, debating it. Some were calling Barron's actions a display of true compassion, praising the young Trump heir for using his platform to help someone in need. Others were skeptical, accusing him of doing it for publicity. But regardless of the opinions, one thing was certain. This story had taken on a life of its own. Social media was flooded with kindness challenge, a viral trend where people began sharing stories of their own good deeds, inspired by what they had seen. Donations to Hope Outreach Resource Center skyrocketed overnight, allowing them to expand their programs and assist more people, like Leonard. Leonard sat there, stunned. He had spent months being invisible, and now in a matter of hours, he had become the face of a movement. And the impact wasn't just coming from strangers. That night, as Leonard lay in bed in the shelter, still trying to process everything, a staff member knocked on his door. "Leonard," she said softly, "there's someone here to see you." Leonard's brow furrowed. He wasn't expecting anyone. He cautiously followed her down the hall, his mind racing through the possibilities. When he stepped into the reception area, his heart nearly stopped. Sitting there, waiting for him, was a man he hadn't seen in over a decade. His younger brother, Paul. Leonard froze, gripping the doorway as if he needed something to steady him. Paul stood up slowly, his face lined with emotions Leonard couldn't yet read. Relief, regret, disbelief. "Leonard." Paul's voice was thick with something between hesitation and hope. "I saw the video." Leonard's throat felt tight. You saw it?" Paul nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "I didn't know things had gotten this bad for you. I should have reached out sooner." The weight of lost years hung between them. Leonard had convinced himself that his brother had moved on, that whatever bond they once had was too broken to fix. But now, standing here in front of him, was proof that it wasn't too late. Leonard swallowed hard, feeling something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope. "I didn't exactly make it easy for anyone to find me," he admitted, his voice quieter now. Paul took a hesitant step closer. "Well, I found you now, and I'm not going anywhere." For the first time in years, Leonard didn't feel like a man lost in the world. He felt found. The two brothers sat down, talking late into the night. There were apologies, there were tears, but more importantly, there was a second chance. The video of Barron's small act of kindness had started something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. It had reached across city lines, across news outlets, across family divides. It had given Leonard not just a fresh start, but the chance to rebuild the most important relationship he had lost. And it all started with $1. As Leonard sat across from his brother, listening to Paul talk about his life, about how he had been searching for him, he realized something. This wasn't just about a viral video. This was about being seen, about being reminded that no one is truly alone. And for the first time in a long time, Leonard believed in the possibility of tomorrow. The days that followed were a whirlwind for Leonard. He had spent nearly a year feeling like he had disappeared, blending into the background of the city, a face in the crowd that no one noticed. But now, the world knew his name. The video of his interaction with Barron Trump had spread like wildfire, turning a simple moment of kindness into a nationwide conversation. News outlets debated whether Barron's actions were a genuine reflection of his character or a calculated move. But beyond the arguments, something unexpected had happened. People had been inspired. Donations to Hope Outreach Resource Centers surged, allowing the organization to provide shelter, meals, and job training to even more people in need. People across the country took up the challenge, paying for strangers' meals, volunteering at shelters, and helping those who had been forgotten by society. The ripple effect was undeniable. And for Leonard, it was even more personal. Since reconnecting with his brother, he had begun taking real steps toward getting back on his feet. He enrolled in a job training program through the shelter, learning new skills that could help him re-enter the workforce. The staff helped him set up doctor's appointments to address the lingering health issues that had contributed to his downward spiral. He even attended counseling sessions, something he never imagined himself doing. It wasn't easy. Some nights, the doubts crept back in, the fear that this was all temporary, that the world would move on and forget, and he would end up right back where he started. But then he would look at the note Barron had given him, the same one he still carried in his pocket, and remind himself, if I help you today, you have to help yourself tomorrow. Tomorrow had come, and Leonard was holding up his end of the deal. One morning, as he sipped coffee in the shelter's common room, a staff member approached him with a curious smile. "Leonard, you have a visitor." Leonard's stomach twisted. Another visitor? He had already been overwhelmed by Paul's return, by the unexpected attention his story had received. Who else could possibly want to see him? As he walked toward the front of the building, his heart nearly stopped. Standing there, calm as ever, was Barron Trump. Leonard blinked, convinced he was seeing things. It had been weeks since their brief interaction on the street, weeks since that $1 request had set everything in motion. He had never expected to see him again. Barron smiled. "Hey, Leonard." Leonard stared, momentarily speechless. "What? What are you doing here?" Barron shrugged, tugging his hands into his pockets. "I just wanted to see how you were doing." Leonard exhaled, running a hand over his face. "Man, you have no idea." He led Barron to a quiet corner of the shelter, where they sat across from each other. Leonard still couldn't believe he was here, the kid who had unknowingly changed his life. Barron leaned forward slightly. "So, tell me, did you keep your promise?" Leonard let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. Yeah, I did." He gestured around. "Got a place to stay, got a plan, even got my brother back in my life." He glanced up, his voice quieter. "I don't think that happens without you." Barron studied him for a moment before offering a small nod. "I think it happens because you chose to show up." Leonard smiled, gripping his coffee cup a little tighter. "Maybe, but you gave me a reason to." Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, placing it on the table between them. Leonard looked down. It was a $1 bill. Leonard raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Barron smirked. "Consider it a refund." Leonard let out a full laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that felt foreign after so many months of struggle. He picked up the bill, shaking his head. "I don't think I can take this." Barron tilted his head. "Sure you can, but this time it's not for you." Leonard frowned, confused. Barron leaned back. "You said I helped you. Now it's your turn to help someone else." Leonard stared at the bill for a long moment, the weight of its meaning settling in. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about passing it forward. A lump formed in Leonard's throat as he closed his fingers around the dollar, nodding slowly. "Yeah, I can do that." Barron stood, offering him a firm handshake. "I know you can." Leonard shook his hand, gripping it tightly. "Thank you, Barron." Barron smiled. "Just keep your promise." As Barron walked toward the door, Leonard watched him go, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Certainty. He had been given a second chance. Now it was his turn to make sure someone else got one too. As Leonard watched Barron walk away, a new sense of purpose filled his heart. The journey that had started with a simple request for $1 had led to something far greater than he could have ever imagined. It had sparked a movement, changed his life, and reminded him that kindness, no matter how small, could create ripples that extended far beyond what the eye could see. But this story is more than just an inspiring tale. The characters in this video are fictional, created to bring a powerful lesson to life. While this exact event may not have happened, its message is deeply real. This story reminds us that small acts of kindness can lead to life-changing moments. We often walk past people without realizing the struggles they carry. Sometimes a simple gesture, a conversation, a helping hand, or even just seeing someone as a person can be the difference between despair and hope. Leonard's journey teaches us that no one is beyond redemption. No matter how lost we feel, how much we think we've fallen, there is always a way forward. But it also shows us that sometimes we need a push. Someone to believe in us before we can believe in ourselves. And Barron's act of kindness? It proves that privilege isn't about what we have, it's about what we do with it. If we are in a position to help, why wouldn't we? So, ask yourself, what small action can you take today to make a difference in someone else's life? Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our latest content. And I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you find today's topic intriguing, comment 1 below. If it doesn't resonate with you, comment 0. Your feedback helps us create better videos that match your interests. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.